Here is something that used to drive me absolutely crazy. I would do everything I thought I was supposed to do for my tomatoes. I would pick the right varieties, start them on time, water them faithfully, and still end up at the end of summer staring at cracked fruit, yellow leaves, and plants that looked like they had given up on life sometime around mid-July. For the longest time, I blamed the weather. I blamed the soil. I even blamed the seed company once, which looking back was not my finest moment. But when I finally sat down and approached it like the science teacher I used to be, tracking every variable, reading the actual research from university extension programs, and running side-by-side comparisons in my own garden over multiple seasons, I discovered that nearly every problem I was having came down to 7 specific mistakes. Not obscure, advanced level errors either. These were things I was doing from day one that I thought were correct, and they were quietly sabotaging my harvest the entire time. In this video, I am going to walk you through all 7 of those mistakes, explain the science behind why each one causes so much damage, and show you exactly what to do instead. And make sure you stick around for the bonus tip at the end, because it is a simple mid-season adjustment that gave me the biggest single improvement in fruit quality I have ever seen in close to 15 years of growing tomatoes. Tomatoes are the most popular home garden crop in the country, and yet they're also the one that frustrates people the most. The reason is that tomatoes are surprisingly sensitive to their environment, and small mistakes compound over a long growing season until you end up with disappointing results and no clear idea what went wrong. I have talked to so many gardeners who tell me they have given up on tomatoes entirely because nothing they tried seemed to work. And almost every time, the issue traces back to one or more of these 7 mistakes. What I have put together here are the errors that, once I corrected them, transformed my tomato harvests completely. Every single one is something I did wrong myself, so there is no judgment here, just the science and the fix. Let us start with the first one. The first one I want to talk about is planting too early, and there is a fascinating reason why this one mistake can set your entire season back. I get it. The temptation is real. You have been staring at tomato seedlings on your windowsill. For weeks, the last frost date passes and you rush them into the ground the next morning. The problem is that tomatoes are not just frost sensitive. They are cold, soil sensitive. The root systems of tomato plants essentially shut down when soil temperatures are below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The fine root hairs that absorb water and nutrients stop growing, and the plant sits in a state of suspended stress. Even if the air temperature feels warm and spring seems to be in full swing, that soil can take weeks to catch up, especially in heavier clay soils that retain cold longer. What most people see is a transplant that just sits there doing nothing for 2 or 3 weeks, and they assume it is acclimating. It is not acclimating. It is struggling. Meanwhile, plants set out just 2 weeks later into warmer soil will often catch up and surpass those early transplants within a month because their roots establish immediately. The fix is simple. Get yourself a soil thermometer. They cost a few dollars, and do not transplant until the soil at 4 inches deep reads at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit consistently. In most of the country, that means waiting until 2 to 3 weeks after your last frost date, not planning on the date itself. For folks in USDA zones 3 through 5, that patience window is even longer because those heavier northern soils hold cold deep into spring. I know it requires patience, and I know your neighbors might have their tomatoes in the ground already. But this single change eliminated that frustrating stall period for me entirely. My later planted tomatoes now consistently outperform the ones I used to rush in. And they do it with healthier root systems that carry them through the stress of midsummer heat. Next up is watering inconsistently, and this one really surprised me when I finally understood the science behind it. Most gardeners know that tomatoes need water. The mistake is not underwatering or overwatering in a general sense. It is the inconsistency, swinging between dry and soaked, that causes the real damage. When the soil dries out significantly and then gets flooded with water, either from heavy irrigation or a sudden thunderstorm, the fruit absorbs moisture rapidly and the skin cannot expand fast enough to keep up. The result is cracking, sometimes radial splits from the stem, sometimes concentric rings around the shoulders, blossom end rot. That ugly black sunken spot on the bottom of the fruit is also linked to Inconsistent watering, it is not technically a calcium deficiency in the soil. It is a calcium transport problem. Calcium moves through the plant dissolved in water, and when water uptake is interrupted by dry spells, calcium stops reaching the developing fruit, even if there is plenty of it in the ground. The fix is deep, consistent watering on a regular schedule. I water my tomatoes deeply every 3 to 4 days in the absence of rain, applying about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week total. I use drip irrigation at the base of the plants, which keeps the delivery slow and even. If you do not have drip irrigation, a soaker hose works well, or even hand watering with a slow stream directed at the soil rather than the foliage. Avoid overhead sprinklers, because wet leaves create ideal conditions for fungal diseases like early blight and septoria leaf spot. And I mulch with 3 to 4 inches of straw around each plant to buffer soil moisture levels between waterings. That mulch layer is doing double duty. It holds moisture in during dry spells and prevents the soil from becoming waterlogged after a heavy rain by slowing absorption. Since I started doing this, cracking and blossom end rot have virtually disappeared from my garden. It sounds almost too simple, but consistency is genuinely the most important factor in tomato watering. Number 3 on our list is skipping or botching the pruning, and here is why it deserves serious attention. There are 2 main types of tomato plants, determinate and indeterminate, and they require completely different pruning approaches. Indeterminate varieties, which include most heirloom and beefsteak types, grow continuously all season and produce suckers at every leaf node. Those suckers are the small shoots that emerge in the crotch between the main stem and a branch. If you let every sucker grow, you end up with an enormous tangled bush that puts its energy into producing foliage instead of ripening fruit. The plant cannot deliver enough water, nutrients, and sugars to dozens of growing tips simultaneously, so you get lots of small, slow ripening tomatoes instead of fewer, larger, better flavored ones. The mistake I made for years was either ignoring suckers entirely or pruning too aggressively by stripping the plant down to a single stem, which reduces yield and exposes fruit to sun scald. The balanced approach is to let your indeterminate tomatoes grow 2 to 3 main stems by keeping the first 1 or 2 suckers that form low on the plant and removing the rest weekly. Pinch suckers when they are small, under 4 inches, so the wound heals quickly and the plant does not lose significant energy. If a sucker has already grown large, use clean pruners rather than tearing it, which can damage the main stem. For determinate varieties like Roma, Celebrity, and Bush Early Girl, which grow to a set size and fruit all at once, do not prune the suckers at all. Those plants need all their branches to produce their single concentrated harvest. Removing suckers from a determinate plant actually reduces your yield, which is the opposite of what you want. This is why it is so important to know which type you're growing. Check the seed packet or plant tag. It will say determinate or indeterminate. Knowing that distinction and pruning accordingly made an immediate, visible difference in my fruit size and ripening speed. I wish someone had explained this to me clearly in my first season instead of just saying to prune your tomatoes without any context. If you are finding this helpful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new videos every week breaking down the science behind growing better food at home. It is free, and it means you will not miss the next one. All right, let us keep going. The 4th pick is neglecting soil preparation. And let me tell you why I think this one is the silent killer of tomato harvests. Most people dig a hole, drop the transplant in, maybe toss a handful of compost on top and call it done. But tomatoes are heavy feeders with a growing season that can stretch 5 months or more. They need a deep, well-prepared planting hole with the right amendments worked in from the start. Here is what I do now, and it changed everything. I dig a hole about 12 inches deep and 10 inches wide. I mix in a generous handful of well-aged compost, a tablespoon of bone meal for phosphorus, which supports root development and flowering, and a tablespoon of Crucite calcium sulfate for slow-release calcium, which helps prevent blossom end rot from the ground up. Then I bury the transplant deep, removing the lower leaves and setting the stem so that about 2/3 of the plant is underground. This is something unique to tomatoes. Those buried stem nodes will sprout adventitious roots, giving the plant a much larger and deeper root system than it would develop From a shallow planting, a bigger root system means better water and nutrient uptake all season long, and it also makes the plant more drought tolerant during those inevitable hot, dry stretches in July and August. I have compared shallow planted and deep planted tomatoes side by side in my garden, and the deep planted ones are visibly more vigorous by midsummer with thicker stems, darker foliage, and heavier fruit loads. Every tomato I plant goes in this way now, and the difference in plant vigor by midsummer is unmistakable. It takes a few extra minutes per plant, but the return on that investment is enormous. The fifth one I want to talk about is ignoring soil pH, and there is a practical reason why this one flies under the radar. Most gardeners never test their soil pH, and that is a problem because tomatoes have a fairly specific preference. They perform best in soil with a pH between 6.2 and 6.8. When the pH drifts too far below or above that range, certain nutrients become chemically locked up in the soil and unavailable to the plant, even if those nutrients are physically present. Phosphorus, for example, becomes increasingly unavailable below a pH of 6.0, which directly impacts flowering and fruit set. You can literally watch a plant sit there with plenty of flowers that refuse to develop into fruit, and the culprit is locked up phosphorus. Calcium availability drops at lower pH levels too, which circles right back to the blossom end rot problem I mentioned earlier. The frustrating part is that you can add all the fertilizer you want and still see deficiency symptoms if the pH is off, because the plant simply cannot access what is in the ground. I test my soil pH every spring with an inexpensive kit from the garden centre. A basic test kit costs a few dollars and takes about 10 minutes to use. If the pH is too low, I work in a small amount of garden lime several weeks before planting to give it time to react with the soil. If it is too high, which is less common, but does happen in alkaline soils across parts of the west and southwest, elemental sulfur can bring it down gradually. This takes 5 minutes and costs almost nothing, but it unlocks everything else you are doing. I wasted years adding amendments to soil that could not deliver them to my plants because the chemistry was working against me. Testing the pH was the key that fixed it, and now it is the very first thing I do each season before I even think about planting. Next up is poor staking and support, and this one really comes back to bite people in mid to late summer when it is too late to fix. Tomato plants, especially indeterminate varieties, can grow 6 feet tall or more and produce heavy clusters of fruit. Without proper support from the beginning, the stems bend and crack under the weight, the fruit contacts the ground where it rots and attracts slugs, and airflow through the canopy drops, which invites fungal diseases like early blight and septoria leaf spot. The mistake I see most often is using those flimsy wire cone cages that you find at the hardware store. They are fine for small determinate varieties, but they buckle and collapse under a vigorous indeterminate plant by August. What I switched to is a system of sturdy 6-foot steel stakes driven 18 inches into the ground at planting time, combined with soft fabric, plant ties every 8 to 10 inches as the plant grows. I tie loosely in a figure 8 pattern, with one loop around the stake and one around the stem, so the stem has room to thicken without the tie cutting into it. For people who prefer cages, look for heavy gauge concrete reinforcing wire formed into cylinders at least 5 feet tall and 18 inches in diameter. The key is to install your support system the same day you transplant, not weeks later when you're trying to wrangle an overgrown plant without snapping stems. Since I started staking properly from day one, I have seen a dramatic reduction in broken branches, ground rot, and fungal problems. Better airflow alone is worth the effort, because most foliar diseases in tomatoes thrive in still, humid conditions inside a dense, unsupported canopy. When you open the plant up with good support and strategic pruning, you create air circulation that keeps the leaves drier and the disease pressure lower. It is one of those areas where a little work at planting time saves you a lot of heartache later in the season. Number 7 on our list is harvesting too late, and here is why it deserves to close out this list. There is a persistent belief that the best tasting tomato is one that ripens fully on the vine until it is deep red and slightly soft to the touch. In certain conditions, that is true. But here is the thing most people miss. Once a tomato reaches what growers call The breaker stage, which is when the first blush of colour appears at the blossom end, the fruit has already detached its nutrient supply from the plant. From that point on, all the ripening happens internally through ethylene gas production. The fruit will develop full colour, full flavour, and full sugar content, whether it is on the vine or sitting on your kitchen counter. The advantage of picking at or just after the breaker stage is significant. You reduce the risk of cracking from sudden rain, you take pressure off the plant so it can direct energy to the remaining fruit, you minimise losses from birds and squirrels who are attracted to fully ripe fruit, and in late season you can rescue green tomatoes before the first frost and let them ripen indoors. I pick my tomatoes at the first sign of consistent colour change now, and I have not noticed any difference in flavour compared to vine-ripened fruit. In fact, in blind taste tests I have done with family and friends, nobody can tell the difference. What I have noticed is dramatically less waste and a longer effective harvest season. I used to lose 10 to 15% of my crop to cracking, pest damage, and over-ripening on the vine. Now that number is close to zero. It was one of those lessons where the science made perfect sense once I heard it, but I had to unlearn years of vine-ripened dogma first. If you take nothing else from this video, try picking a few tomatoes early at the breaker stage and see for yourself. I think you will be surprised. Now, this is something I stumbled onto about 8 years into my gardening journey, and it completely changed the flavour and quality of my tomatoes. The technique is reducing watering during the final ripening phase. Once your tomato plants have a full load of fruit and the earliest ones are starting to show colour, I cut my watering back by about 30 to 40%. Not enough to wilt the plant or cause leaf curl, just enough to put it under mild, controlled water stress. You will still see healthy green foliage, but the soil should be drying out more between waterings than it did during the growing phase. The science behind this is well documented in commercial tomato production, particularly in Mediterranean climates where dry farming is a tradition. When the plant receives slightly less water during ripening, the sugars, acids, and volatile flavour compounds in the fruit become more concentrated because there is less water diluting them. The result is a tomato with noticeably more intense, complex flavour. Think of it like the difference between a watery supermarket tomato and one from a dry, farmed field in California. You are mimicking that same principle on a small scale in your own backyard. I still mulch and I still water consistently through the growing phase, but once ripening begins, I ease off gradually. The improvement in taste was one of those moments where I picked the first tomato of the season, bit into it right there in the garden, and immediately understood why this technique exists. It was richer, sweeter, and more complex than anything I had grown before using my old watering approach. That is everything I have for you today. Gardening is one of those things where the more you learn, the more you realize there is to discover, especially with a crop as rewarding and occasionally maddening as tomatoes. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next video.